nominate Andrew Wheeler to be administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Wheeler is very qualified for that position. He spent over 25 years working in environmental policy, and in that time he has served as a career employee at the agency, as a staffer here on Capitol Hill, and as a consultant in the private sector, and now in a leadership role of the EPA. I believe Andrew Wheeler would make an excellent administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. With that, I call this hearing to order. Today, the committee will hear testimony on the Environmental Protection Agency's work to protect the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the communities we call home. And it's my pleasure to welcome back to the committee Andrew Wheeler in his new role as acting administrator of the EPA. First, Mr. Wheeler, as you know, the way that this committee works, sometimes there are roll call votes. I understand there are 5 roll call votes starting at 11 this morning. So there'll be members coming and going during the hearing process. But so I appreciate your indulgence as we come in and out. Mr. Wheeler has served on this committee in a number of capacities, most recently as staff director. It's only fitting that our committee be the first that you testify before in your new role. Since President Trump has come to office, his administration has made it a priority to pursue policies that both protect the nation's environment and allow the economy to grow. Just last week, we saw how the administration's pro-growth and pro-jobs policies are leading to incredible economic growth. America's economy grew at an impressive 4.1%. Over the past year and a half, the Environmental Protection Agency has been busy rolling back punishing regulations that hurt the economy in my home state of Wyoming and communities across the country. Under the previous administration, the agency created broad and legally questionable regulation that punished the very communities EPA claimed to be protecting. The so-called Clean Power Plan would have cost Wyoming energy workers their jobs and closed power plants across the country. The Obama administration openly declared war on American coal and the workers who produce this critically important resource. The so-called Clean Power Plan wasn't just bad policy, it was illegal. 24 states, including Wyoming, filed suit to block this regulation. The Supreme Court has put the rule on hold because of the challenges. Under the leadership of President Trump, the EPA is now taking steps to undo this damaging rule. The agency held listening sessions in several different communities to hear feedback on how the regulation should be changed or withdrawn. One of those listening sessions took place in Campbell County, Wyoming, in the city of Gillette. Wyoming is the leading coal-producing state in the nation. The vast majority of the coal from the nation comes from Campbell County. America can't afford to leave its energy resources stranded in the ground. I'm thankful the EPA took the time to listen to all stakeholders and re-examine the agency's deeply flawed rule. It was an important example of Washington listening to the people of Wyoming. The administration has also taken major steps to revise the waters of the United States, or the WOTUS rule. This outrageous Obama-era rule would have put backyard ponds, puddles, and farm fields under Washington's control. Under that rule, the EPA told farmers and ranchers their irrigation ditches were considered navigable waters and would be regulated by the federal government. The consequences were staggering. The EPA threatened to fine one private landowner in Wyoming $75,000 a day. The crime he committed was digging a stock pond in his backyard. This past January, the EPA delayed the implementation date of this devastating rule. This delay gives the agency time to revise it. EPA should not punish our ranchers or farmers for managing their land. They must replace the WOTUS rule with common sense policy that protects America's waters and respects states and local authorities. The agency has also taken important steps to protect small refineries in Wyoming and across the country. I applaud the Trump administration for rejecting efforts to undermine the ability of small refineries to obtain hardship relief under the renewable fuel standards of the RFS. During the Obama administration, EPA frequently ignored the law, which requires EPA to grant relief to small refineries suffering economic hardship under RSF. Since then, 2 federal appeals courts have rebuked the agency for decisions denying hardship relief to small refineries. EPA must not take any action that would limit the ability of small refineries to obtain hardship relief, restrict when small refineries can apply for hardship relief, disclose the confidential business information of small refineries, or increase the burdens on other refineries. Taking any of these steps would only compound the problems that this broken program has created for American refineries and their workers. So I look forward to hearing more about what the agency is doing to protect the people of Wyoming and America, to keep our environment clean, and to support the nation's growing economy. Acting Administrator Wheeler, thank you for taking the time to come testify today. Thank you for making the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee your first stop on Capitol Hill. I'd now like to turn to Ranking Member Carper for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As my colleagues know, on this committee and outside of the committee, I've been asking for an oversight hearing with the EPA Administrator for many months. And I'm pleased that our committee is holding that hearing today. And I got to be honest with you, I'm even more pleased that the person sitting at the witness table is our acting administrator and not his predecessor. When Mr. Wheeler took the helm of this agency all 25 days ago, probably seems like 25 months ago, 25 days ago, the Washington Post noted that we were trading an administrator who was known for, quote, sipping organic juice infused with kale, for an acting administrator who collects Coca-Cola memorabilia. And with that said, Mr. Wheeler, I have something to present to you today as we begin this hearing to add to your collection. It's something that my staff found for sale in, of all places, the Senate cafeteria. I thought you might like to have it. It's a bottle of Coca-Cola. It actually has the word Wheeler. I don't know if you have some kind of special deal. Something in your life we don't know about, Andrew, but this is very interesting. But this is your bottle. You'll probably need something stronger before you're finished. But I'm encouraged that there will be a number of differences between Mr. Wheeler and Mr. Pruitt in the way that they approach this important leadership role. For example, I don't expect to hear as much as a peep from Mr. Wheeler today about used mattress shopping or Chick-fil-A or fancy moisturizers. But what we do need to hear from Mr. Wheeler today is how he plans to differentiate himself from Mr. Pruitt across a range of environmental policies that are far more consequential. How will he repair the significant damage that Mr. Pruitt has done to the EPA? Will the American public once again be able to trust the EPA to carry out its mission of protecting public health and our environment? Now, I believe in giving credit where credit is due. In the few weeks that Mr. Wheeler has been the acting administrator, he's published his calendars on a daily basis. He's opened up EPA events to the media, as well as began to work to ensure that EPA's beleaguered career staff once again feel valued, respected, and included. He withdrew Mr. Pruitt's parting act to stop enforcing air emission standards for some of the dirtiest heavy-duty trucks on the road under the Clean Air Act, granting one company permission to continue building high-polluting glider trucks for 2 years. Thank you for that. There's a whole lot more to be done. Mr. Wheeler has told me repeatedly that he shares my goal of striking a deal between automakers and the state of California and other states on fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe standards. Unfortunately, the administration's proposal could not be further from the win-win outcome that many of us on this committee and outside this committee believe is within reach. Instead of providing near-term flexibility and predictability for the auto industry in exchange for more rigorous standards and clean vehicle incentives going forward, the Trump administration is proposing to freeze standards for 7 straight model years. We can do better than that, and we need to. The administration would remove all credits for air conditioning and other improvements and argue that California should be preempted. Such a proposal is not the win-win outcome that stakeholders are asking for, one that keeps the American auto industry competitive, creates more good-paying jobs right here at home, and protects our environment well into the future. Instead, this administration has once again ignored common sense, turned its back on a solution that would allow for states like California to enforce its own clean standards, and decide to listen to the most extreme voices as it pushing through to listen to the most extreme voices as it pushing through a plan no one is interested in. Mr. Pruitt's EPA also had a warped sense of cooperative federalism, especially when it came to protecting downwind states from harmful air pollution. Under Mr. Pruitt, EPA failed to meet the deadlines to designate who was living in unhealthy ozone areas and delayed emission reductions critical to downwind states. At the same time, Mr. Pruitt's EPA rejected requests from downwind states to require upwind polluters to install or operate existing pollution controls, try to cut state air program funding, and weaken enforcement efforts. All of these efforts, all of these actions were a disaster for the people like those in my own home state of Delaware, states of Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and others on the East Coast who live at the end of what we call America's tailpipe. Instead of prioritizing and protecting the polluters, I hope Mr. Wheeler will prioritize and protect the people who are being harmed from those emissions. Under Mr. Pruitt, EPA has also acted to roll back clean water protections by, I think, dishonestly inflating the cost of those rules to industry while minimizing the health and environmental benefits to the public. Mr. Wheeler needs to describe how he plans to ensure that clean water and other rules are based on credible data, how they comply with the law. Mr. Pruitt misguidedly banned any scientist who had received EPA grant funding from serving on EPA scientific advisory committees. He proposed to have EPA ignore and not consider some of the best scientific studies in the world. It's my sincere hope that Mr. Wheeler will share with us his plans for ending EPA's war on science. And disappointingly, too, there's probably no aspect of EPA's implementation of the new Toxic Substance Control Act that will not be litigated. And Mr. Pruitt's EPA chose to blatantly disregard the clear and unambiguous law that we largely wrote right here in this committee, and Congress passed with near unanimous support. And this kind of blatant disregard for the rule of law needs to end, and it needs to end here. Mr. Wheeler needs to describe how he plans to stop wasting taxpayer funds and EPA lawyers' time defending proposals that are clearly illegal, and restore the agency to one that respects the rule of law and is guided by science. The day after Mr. Pruitt resigned, I sent Mr. Wheeler a letter. I told him, quote, "You have been granted an enormous challenge and responsibility, but an even greater opportunity. The damage that Scott Pruitt has done to this agency will not be easily undone. While you and I have not always agreed and will not always agree on every environmental policy matter, it is my hope and expectation that you will carefully consider the lessons of the past as you prepare to chart the agency's future." We look forward to a continued dialogue and to today's hearing. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Carper. And we'll now hear from our witness in a few seconds, and that's the Honorable Andrew Wheeler, the Acting Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Public Protection Agency. I want to remind Mr. Wheeler that your full written testimony will be made part of the official hearing record, so please keep your comments and your statement to about 5 minutes, so we'll have time for questions from the members of the committee. So I look forward to hearing your testimony. Mr. Wheeler.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Carper, and members of the committee. When Senator Barrasso called me, Chairman Barrasso called me to ask me if this would be my first hearing, I jumped to the opportunity because I couldn't think of another committee that I would want to testify in front of first. When President Trump appointed me acting administrator, he asked me to focus on 3 things: clean up the air, clean up the water, and provide regulatory relief to help the economy thrive and create more jobs for American workers. I believe we can accomplish all 3 at the same time. In fact, we have already made progress on all 3 fronts in just the past few weeks. We haven't slowed down and we haven't missed a step. Yesterday, we released EPA's annual report on air quality, and we have great news to share. From 1970 to 2017, the combined emissions of the 6 key pollutants regulated under the NAAQS dropped by 73%, while the U.S. economy grew more than 260%. This is a remarkable achievement that should be recognized and celebrated. The U.S. leads the world in terms of clean air and air quality progress. On my first day as acting administrator, we sent to OMB for interagency review a proposed rule to set state guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. We recently finalized the first set of revisions to the 2015 regulations for the disposal of coal ash. These actions will provide states and utilities much-needed flexibility in the management of their waste. Last week, we issued a final rule that codifies the animal waste reporting exemptions, which were signed into law in the Fair Agriculture Reporting Method, the Farm Act, Senator Fisher's legislation. We also approved pathways for biodiesel derived from sorghum. This action lays the groundwork for more homegrown fuels under the Renewable Fuels Standard and adds diversity to the nation's biofuels mix. Finally, we recently commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the Superfund Task Force report and highlighted the extraordinary progress we've made cleaning up sites and returning them to a productive use. Just this week, we reached a framework to address the outstanding issues of the Anaconda smelter site in Montana. This framework will allow us to meet our goal of delisting the site by 2025, and this site has been on the list for decades. As you can see, we're continuing the President's agenda post-haste. The combination of regulatory relief and the President's historic tax cuts continues to spur economic growth across the country, particularly in communities that were previously and wrongly ignored or forgotten. One way we can fulfill the President's agenda is providing more certainty to the American people. A lack of certainty from EPA hinders the environmental protections and creates paralysis in the marketplace. We will prioritize certainty in 3 areas: certainty to the states and local governments, including tribes, certainty within EPA programs, such as permitting and enforcement actions, and certainty in risk communication. First, we need to provide more certainty to the states, who are the primary implementers and enforcers of many of our environmental laws and programs. We will work closely with the states to ensure our mutual responsibilities under the law are fulfilled. Second, we need to provide more certainty within EPA programs. For example, we need to improve our permitting processes. Our goal is to make all permit decisions up or down in 6 months. I am not suggesting that we approve all permits within a set amount of time. On a similar front, we must provide more certainty in our enforcement actions. When EPA's enforcement actions linger for years, it hurts the competitiveness of American businesses. Let me be clear, I am not advocating for letting people off the hook or reducing fines. Rather, I'm advocating for making enforcement decisions in a timely and consistent manner. Third and finally, we need to provide more certainty in risk communication. As an agency, we must be able to speak with one voice and clearly explain to the American people the environmental and health risks that they face in their daily lives. We have fallen short in this area, from our response to 9/11 to recent events surrounding the Gold King mine in Colorado, and most recently in Flint, Michigan. We owe it to the American public to ensure that this does not happen again. We're also prioritizing our efforts to assist state and local governments in preparing for and responding to natural disasters and extreme weather events. Readiness is all, to quote my favorite author, Shakespeare. There is no doubt in my mind that we will make improvements in all of these areas. I believe in this agency, I believe in its mission, and I believe in its personnel. I'd like to take a minute to talk about my fellow EPA employees. I know how dedicated and passionate they are, and it is a privilege to work alongside them.
If I could have the witness suspend, please, and ask the officers to remove the disturbance. Apologize for the delay. Thank you.
Quite all right. I'd like to take a minute to talk about my fellow EPA employees. I know how dedicated and passionate they are, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. I've told them that my instinct will be to defend their work, and I will seek the facts from them before drawing conclusions. We exist to serve the public. As such, we should conduct our business in a manner fully deserving of the public's trust and confidence. Earlier this week, I issued my own fishbowl memo, which lays out the principles and protocols that will guide our efforts to be transparent, open, and accountable to the American public. Our success as an agency depends on it. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll start with some questioning, if I may, and I wanted to start by mentioning what I see happening right now in the state of Washington. The state of Washington is abusing Section 401 of the Clean Water Act in order to block the development of coal export terminal in that state. The terminal would ship coal from Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and Colorado to markets in Asia. The state of Washington has cited reasons for objecting to the terminal that had nothing to do with water quality, yet they're using Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. I introduced a bill this week to address this problem. We can't allow states to block the export of American energy. So will you commit to working with me to identify both legislative and regulatory solutions to stop these abuses?
Yes, Senator, I will.
Thank you. Recently there have been some stories in the press discussing some recusals from former clients and meetings that you took as your recusals in terms of the meetings you've taken as deputy administrator. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to address the stories and, if necessary, clarify the record. Would you visit with us about that and maybe tell the committee how you're going to honor your recusals from former clients?
Absolutely. I've committed under both the Trump ethics pledge and the ethics regulations to follow all the guidelines. I've worked with our career ethics official at the EPA. I met with her for the first time before I was actually nominated to go over what the requirements would be. And I have not met with any of my clients that I represented for the 2 years prior to joining the agency. There's one article that mentioned that there was a former client that was in a couple of meetings that I attended. I want to clarify that those weren't meetings, they were actually speeches. I gave speeches at 2 trade associations, and the client was in the audience in those speeches. And that's according to the ethics, as long as there's more than 5 people, and there was 5 times as many people as that in the audience. And I can't control the people that attend a public speech.
Thank you. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA grant relief to small refineries which suffer disproportionate economic hardship under the renewable fuel standards, the RFS. The law explicitly states that a small refinery may petition the EPA for hardship relief, it says, at any time. So do you agree that the EPA doesn't have the authority to limit when small refineries can apply for hardship relief?
Absolutely. We cannot limit when they apply for the relief, no.
The law further states the EPA must act within 90 days upon receiving a petition from a small refinery. Do you agree the EPA doesn't have the authority to delay decisions on a small refinery's petition beyond 90 days?
Yeah, I'm not sure to the extent that we've met the 90-day requirements, but we certainly try to meet all the requirements under all of our statutes.
And in December of 2017, I sent Administrator Pruitt a letter encouraging the EPA to withdraw its proposed rule on in situ uranium recovery, ISR. The Obama administration proposed the rule on January 19th, 2017, the final day before President Obama left office. Well, since then, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, our nation's principal nuclear regulator, has stated that there is, quote, no health or safety jurisdiction for EPA's rulemaking. So uranium production is vital to our country's national security, our energy security. Wyoming produces more uranium than any other state. When can we expect the EPA to scrap this unnecessary regulation that came out, kind of a midnight regulation, came out by the Obama administration on the final day of the 8-year administration?
Senator, I've not had the opportunity to be briefed on that in the last 4 weeks, but I know that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission also has concerns about that, and we will try to work forward on that expeditiously.
And during the first year of the Trump administration, it's my understanding the EPA finalized 22 deregulatory actions. So according to your agency, these actions could save over $1 billion in regulatory costs to Americans. Just last July, it was announced that the American economy grew 4.1%. This continues the trend of strong economic growth under the Trump administration. In your opinion, is the administration's approach to environmental deregulation at the EPA protecting the environment while also helping our economy? And essentially, can we have both a strong economy and a healthy environment at the same time?
Yes, we can, and I think the data shows that. Thank you.
Senator Carper.
Again, welcome today, and thank you for...
Thank you, and thank you for the Coke. I need to clear that through our ethics in-house, but I do appreciate that. Thank you.
If it doesn't clear, I'm sure you'll have some takers here.
I'll be happy to
bring out the ice.
I'll be happy to buy it from you.
There you go. Ms. Wheeler, you've told me more than once that you share my goal, I think our goal, of striking a deal between automakers in the state of California and other states on fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe standards, a real win-win is what we're looking for. The auto industry in the state of California have also repeatedly told me that they want a deal. Unfortunately, the administration's proposal that is being released this week is reported to freeze standards at model year 2020 levels, eliminate technology incentives, and preempt California and the 12 states that have followed California's lead, which I believe would be a lose-lose-lose situation. A loss for an industry that needs certainty and predictability, a loss for consumers, and a loss for our environment. The largest source of air pollution in our country today, it's not coal-fired utilities, it's not manufacturers, it's not cement plants, it is mobile sources. That's number one. So I got a couple of questions to pursue in this regard. Well, first one would be if you were presented with a proposal that both the auto industry and the state of California, and 12 states aligned with them, could support, would you welcome such a compromise?
I would certainly welcome such a compromise. You know, the proposal that's coming out this week is first, it is a proposal. And we're taking a range of comments from a flatline approach all the way to the numbers that President Obama's proposal had, and a number of steps in between. So we're taking comments on all of those levels, and we would welcome any comments or proposals from any of the impacted groups. Absolutely.
Just to follow up on that, could we assume on this committee, could we assume that if there was such a deal, essentially a 50-state deal, there would be no effort to preempt California?
It's my goal, it's the administration's goal to come up with a 50-state solution, and we want to have a 50-state solution that does not necessitate preempting California. However, it's important that there's a number of goals in the proposal, and there's important goals on highway safety. So we'd have to make sure that those are met. The proposal will save 1,000 lives per year, which I think is very important, and make sure that we maintain that in any final regulation that goes forward.
I do a lot of customer calls. I know my colleagues do as well, businesses large and small. And Delaware used to build more cars, trucks, vans per capita than any state in America. We had a GM plant, Chrysler plant, employed 8,000 people, and those two plants lost them both at the bottom of the Great Recession. And I still do customer calls with the auto industry. And I ask them three questions. How are you doing? How are we doing? And what can we do to help? Unanimously, they say, with respect to this, what you can do is give us predictability and certainty. They say, we don't want to have to build one Chevrolet Malibu for California and 12 other states and then a different model for the other 37 states. They say, we're happy to have more, we want near-term flexibility on these standards, but we're happy to have more rigorous standards going forward. We don't want to be in court for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years with California and other states. Give us a certainty and predictability and enable us to really to compete with the rest of the world when we get to 2025 and 2030. I just ask that we keep that in mind. Second subject, cross-state pollution. Delaware has made, and other states have made great strides in cleaning up our state's ozone pollution. Yet in northern Delaware, where my family and I live, where 2/3 of our citizens live, still does not meet ozone health standards due to emissions not from within our state, but from other states' dirty cars and power plants drifting into our state. 94% of our air pollution in Delaware comes from sources outside of us, largely to the west and the north. In 2016, Delaware filed 4 clean air petitions with EPA, 4, showing that 4 fossil fuel plants, 3 in Pennsylvania, 1 in West Virginia, are contributing to our unhealthy ozone days. The cleanup solutions are easy. The 3 facilities in Pennsylvania have clean air pollution technology installed. They don't use it. They don't use it. And so the facility over in West Virginia, my native West Virginia coal facility, they could go to natural gas and help not only their air quality but ours as well. But we thought Delaware's case was a slam dunk, and I was shocked when EPA proposed to reject these petitions. And there are just a couple of yes or no questions, if I could. Before making a final decision, would you commit to reviewing Delaware's rebuttal to EPA's proposed rejections, which were sent to you July 23rd, 2018. I'm asking for you to commit to review our rebuttal.
I'd be happy to review that, Senator.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Since EPA has refused to have a hearing on this issue in Delaware, would you commit to meet personally with state of Delaware officials before making a final decision on this matter at the place and time of your convenience?
I'd be happy to talk to the officials in Delaware, yes.
Thank you. Yes or no, and I don't usually ask yes or no questions, so bear with me, please. When making final decisions on any Section 126 petition from some of the other states on the end of America's tailpipe, or neighboring states, will you follow the spirit and letter of the law, which requires EPA to prioritize the residents of the state which receive the pollution?
Yes, Senator. We will follow the letter and spirit of the law. I would add also that on the cross-border side, we are working with states to develop new technical tools to help them facilitate the good neighbor state plans. And on the ozone, at this point, we're showing that all the areas should be, except for a few areas that have been longstanding and non-attainment, should be in attainment by the early 2020s.
All right.
We're very positive about we're looking very positive of the data that's coming in on that.
Now, I would just say, Mr. Chairman, if I could, in closing, I think everybody in this committee, I know the folks here pretty well, and we're golden rule people. We treat other people the way we want to be treated. And the idea that folks in states to our west put up pollution, keep their air clean, their health care costs low, and we end up with dirty air and higher health care costs, it's just not fair. It's not the way to treat our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Before turning to Senator Inhofe, Andrew, I would say that we're going to start voting shortly, and I'll go vote and turn the chair over to Senator Inhofe at the time, who will be chairing the committee until I return. Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I liked your opening statement. You know, it's certainty that we want, and that we deserve, that we have not been historically given. I want to elaborate a little bit with a question asked a little bit differently than the comment by the ranking member. Last year, the EPA, along with the Department of Energy, granted 33 of 34 hardship exemptions to refineries due to high RIN costs. The EPA was sued on one petition it denied and ended up losing in court. Opponents of these exemptions say that the refineries are not under a hardship, even though they're actually paying more than their payroll to comply with these mandates that are out there. But if you look at the fact that the EPA has now lost twice in court for not approving exemptions, the EPA is simply applying the law when it does grant them, and they should be approving more of them. How does the EPA thread this needle?
And it is a very difficult needle to thread. You know, we are following the statute, and we now have had 2 court cases that have ruled against the agency on the granting of the exemptions. We also have appropriations language to remind us to grant the small refinery exemptions. Mm-hmm. One area we are trying to do is to provide more transparency around the decisions that we're making on the small refinery exemptions. Okay. And I think that will help clear up a lot of the concerns around the issue.
Yeah, I think it will. Now, President Trump and you have committed to returning EPA to cooperative federalism, which I applaud. Unfortunately, some have confused that principle with coercive federalism, where one state dictates their standard to all others. When it comes to the auto industry, and we talked about this a minute ago, the last administration handed over car emission standards to California, but other states didn't get to weigh in. Because of this, Oklahomans, my state of Oklahoma, are paying more for their SUVs and trucks to subsidize electric cars so California drivers can afford them, which I find personally a little offensive. I applaud the EPA and NHTSA for revisiting the midterm review done at the last minute by the Obama administration. Now, EPA doesn't have any statutory direction for its auto regulations, but NHTSA does. Do you think EPA and NHTSA should harmonize their regulations so technological feasibility and consumer costs are considered?
Yes, Senator, I do, and that's what we've done.
All right. And lastly, I had the honor of attending your opening statement. It was a very good statement. You had all the employees. I don't know how many hundred were there, but you got a very fine response from there. Your opening remarks to the EPA employees, and you mentioned the fact that the United States is the gold standard worldwide for the environmental protection, and that pollution regulated under NAAQS has dropped 73%. You mentioned this again opening statement. Nobody ever talks about the success that we have, that we're riding on. Meanwhile, our economy has expanded 3 times over, and yet the pollution regulated dropped some 73%. The problem that we had in the 8 years of Obama administration was the use of regulations to punish industries and states to reshape our economy with little to no benefit for the environment. Can you elaborate on how you have both a clean environment without handcuffing our economy. How do you plan to do that?
Absolutely. I think that goes to my comments on certainty. I think if we provide more certainty, not just to the regulated community, but to the American people, so that everybody understands the decisions that we're making and why we're making them, will continue to improve the environment and provide that certainty that businesses are looking for.
Yeah, that's good. And aren't there instances when regulations, such as the new source review, can actually get in the way of reducing pollution?
It can. It can be a disincentive for installing cleaner technologies.
Yeah.
And we're trying to stop that.
Good. Good. Thank you very much. You've done a great job.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Senator Cardin.
Mr. Wheeler, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Senator.
I noticed your comments about the improvements in air over the last 40, 50 years. I might tell you we've seen remarkable improvement in the Chesapeake Bay during that period of time. And I say that because the Chesapeake Bay also has been a program that was developed with state flexibility. It's state blueprints that are agreed to by the 6 surrounding states of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as the District of Columbia. And it's had the strong support from Congress, including this committee recently, as well as from the Environmental Protection Agency. So my first question, recognizing the importance of the Chesapeake Bay, not just to the surrounding states, but to our region, it's the largest estuary in our hemisphere, will you continue the traditional Environmental Protection Agency support for a strong federal role in coordinating the work that's done on the Chesapeake Bay?
Absolutely. My first week as the Deputy Administrator, I attended the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and next week I will be attending the Chesapeake Bay Leadership Council in Baltimore. It is a high priority for us. I actually live in the Chesapeake Resource Protection area, and it's a high priority for the agency.
I don't consider that to be a conflict, so you can do whatever you want to protect our bay. I would just ask you also to work closely with the members of this committee and Congress that have a deep interest in the Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. The EPA Inspector General recently released a report analyzing the federal government's role in the lead contamination crisis in Flint, Michigan, with the hopes of avoiding another crisis in another city. Will you accept and implement the recommendations of the Inspector General?
Start criticizing so I can use this.
I know that our staff has reviewed the recommendations, and we're in the process of planning an implementation program to make sure that we implement them. I haven't been fully briefed on how we're going to implement them yet, but it is a high priority for the agency, and we are moving forward to make sure that something like Flint, Michigan does not happen again.
I guess that's as strong as commitment I'm going to get here today, but I would just urge you, the Inspector General gives an independent view. It's important that their report receives the respect from the agency.
It is.
Thank you. I also appreciate what you said about the workforce, your people that work at the EPA. The first question I have, I recognize the struggle that every cabinet person has with OMB, but are you going to be an advocate for the funds necessary for the EPA in order to be able to carry out its work and be there fighting for the resources you need to carry out your mission?
Yes, I am an advocate for the resources that we need, and we will fully implement the appropriations that Congress gives us.
That was the second question I was going to ask. You already anticipated it, but a former staffer here understands the questions that are coming. That's good. Let me just follow up on that. You said that you wanted to respect the recommendations given to you by your scientists and your professional staff. I assume that also means the Science Advisory Board, and that's a resource that you have, and it has been called into challenge in the last 2 years. Are you committed to allowing the experts to give you unfettered information for you to make the decisions that need to be made? And will you also commit to allow them to participate in policy conferences so that you can have the interaction which we've seen over the long period of time with EPA?
Yes, Senator, I would commit to both of those.
Thank you. Lastly, let me just ask you about your vision as to what you need and support in order to carry out your mission. The EPA is responsible for clean air, clean water, for our clean environment. You have a new toxic chemical law that's been working on. There is concern that chemicals are not being treated as intended by Congress. Do you pledge to work with us and outside interest groups to make sure that we do get an independent evaluation of issues such as toxic chemicals, to make sure that they are given the independent evaluation as to whether they need to be regulated?
Yes, Senator, I do. And I started my career in the toxics chemical program at EPA in 1991. I worked there for 4 years, and I'm excited to be part of the implementation of the new Lautenberg chemical law. And we want to make sure that we're implementing it in the same manner in which Congress intended it when they passed it.
And if we have information, you will consider the information we send to you?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you.
Well,
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today to testify. Senator Inhofe mentioned earlier the importance of certainty. And one of the things I'd like to ask you about is the fact that on June 27th, then EPA Administrator Pruitt issued a memo reorienting the agency's approach to when and how it would veto Clean Water Act Section 404 permits issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Recognizing the agency has not acted on the authority often, only 13 times since 1980, the threat remains that the EPA could stop an infrastructure project that has already gone through a lengthy and expensive permitting process and already received approval to proceed. Threat adds uncertainty to permitting and jeopardizes support for infrastructure projects. Will EPA, under your direction, proceed with the rulemaking to align the 404C process with the June 27th memo?
we are looking into that, and as we move forward, I think it is very important to provide that certainty. And I agree that that's been even though it's been rarely used by the agency, it has created a lot of uncertainty even when it wasn't used.
Good. Well, we would appreciate you looking at that. As acting administrator, you will have a highly influential role in advising the President on how to implement or modify the regulatory footprint of environmental policy in our nation. How do you anticipate your past experiences will help you in improving the way the EPA engages with all stakeholders?
Well, first of all, having started my career at the agency as a career employee, I think that's helped me a lot in understanding the processes and the people at the agency. But I think my 14 years working here at this committee and meeting with a wide variety of stakeholders from a number of states all across the country, international as well, has given me appreciation for the different conflicting policy areas that we have at the agency, and that we need to make sure that we're talking to all interested groups as we move forward with any regulation.
Very good. The criticism of EPA during the previous administration was the agency's disconnect with rural America. Rural America is having a difficult time right now. Many hardworking Americans in rural states felt they did not have a voice and their opinions did not matter. What have you done? What do you feel in other words, what is your planning in the future to facilitate a stronger level of trust between EPA and rural America?
Well, I think it's very important to make sure that all of our regulatory actions, our guidance documents, everything takes into account the impact on rural America. The announcement that we made last week on the sorghum pathway for the renewable fuels, and that's going to help a lot of rural communities across the upper Midwest. I think making sure that we take actions like that to help grow the economy in rural areas is very important.
Very good. EPA during the Obama administration encroached into other agencies' jurisdictions, resulting in EPA making decisions on issues where they lack the expertise. Can we count on you to work with other agencies and take their expertise into careful consideration when developing and implementing rules and regulations?
Yes, we will. We are taking those into consideration, Senator.
It seems to me that our air permitting system is in desperate need of updating. The current system we have in place sometimes overstates the air quality impacts of new projects, which can lead to delays or canceled investments and lost opportunities. What does the agency plan to do to fix the broken permitting and new source review programs?
We have implemented several guidance documents, new guidance to the states and to the regulated community on new source review, and we're looking at those now to see which ones of those we need to move forward on regulatory actions to make sure that we provide that certainty. As Senator Inhofe said on new source review, oftentimes it can be counterproductive on cleaning up the environment when it's a disincentive for installing cleaner, more efficient technologies.
Very good. Companies have made billions of dollars in investments complying with the 2013 boiler maximum achievable control technology rule. While the rule was expensive, it was generally achievable. Unfortunately, regulatory uncertainty remains given recent court decisions sending a couple of issues back to EPA to address. When will EPA complete this rulemaking so facilities can know they have met all of their boiler obligations?
Senator, I'm not positive on the timeline for that, but I'd be happy to look into that and get back to your office.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Bozeman. Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, sir. It's good to see you here. Mr. Wheeler, I want to focus on EPA's TSCA implementation, if I can. And I'd like to start by saying that I'm pleased with the strategic plan that the EPA released to reduce animal testing. I was really grateful for that, and I hope that this is an issue that we can work together on moving forward. But overall, I'm concerned about how the EPA is choosing to implement the changes to TSCA that my colleagues and I on this committee, in a bipartisan way, worked so hard on last Congress. I know you're probably aware of that. One area I'm concerned about is the EPA's failure to consider all the sources of exposure that people have to the toxic chemicals that EPA has started to review. In our amended TSCA law, EPA was told by Congress to examine the safety of all known, intended, and reasonably foreseeable uses of a chemical, and the combined impacts of all exposures to a particular chemical when making their determination about whether a chemical presents an unreasonable risk of harm. But EPA's problem formulations have dramatically narrowed the conditions that the agency will use to evaluate the safety of the first 10 chemicals under TSCA. EPA is now indicating that it will ignore known exposures to those first 10 toxic chemicals, including for the known carcinogen TCE. EPA has warned since 2011 that TCE causes cancer, and in 2017 proposed to ban specific uses of TCE, but under Scott Pruitt's leadership, EPA proposed to indefinitely postpone the ban on this deadly chemical. In Jersey, we have many communities that have been harmed by TCE, but there is one community outside of New Jersey in Franklin, Indiana, that I want to focus on. In Franklin, they've discovered that the community has high levels of TCE in their groundwater and in the air outside many homes. And the children in Franklin are getting cancer at inordinately high rates. Carrie and Matt Reinhardt, who are in the audience right now, their daughter, Emma Grace, died 4 years ago from brain cancer when she was 13 years old. Stacy and Matt Davidson, who are also here, their son, Zane, has leukemia, but thank God it is currently in recession. High-level exposure of TCE makes these families part of a vulnerable subpopulation under the TSCA law. But EPA is now saying that it will ignore exposures that come from land, air, and water, meaning it will ignore the types of TCE exposures that these and other families have so painfully endured in deciding whether or not TCE is safe. The scaling back of our bipartisan chemical safety law, one of the prouder moments I've had as a senator, was set in motion by Scott Pruitt. And I'm really hopeful that you're going to reverse course on what I think is a bad decisions, and the families here agree with me. So, Mr. Wheeler, as part of the evaluation process, would you commit to comprehensively reviewing the risks of chemicals like TCE by including known releases of chemicals into our air, water, and land, releases that threaten communities across the country?
Senator, I'm trying to keep track of all the parts of your question. On the last part, I'm going to start with that. And it is tragic for any chemical to cause death of a child, and my heart goes out to those families impacted by that. Absolutely, we need to be moving forward to do something on this, on TCE and the other chemicals, which is why we included TCE on the list of the first 10 chemicals for review.
Well, I guess
under
the yes or no I was asking is, would you commit to comprehensively reviewing the risks of chemicals by including known releases into our air, land, and water, releases like the TCE?
Is my understanding that we are looking at those pathways as we look at the chemicals on the list, and I will need to double check with our chemical office on that, but is my understanding as part of the 10 chemicals, as TCE being one of the first 10 chemicals that we are examining, the different pathways.
But I worry about, it was Scott Pruitt's decision to move forward within 30 days to finalize the ban, on specific uses of TCE. I'm worried that that's something that's moving forward. We need to reverse that decision. Do you understand?
I think I understand what you're saying, but let me check on the status of that.
And then let me very quickly, methylene chloride. In January 2017, EPA proposed banning all consumer and commercial uses of methylene chloride in paint strippers. The ban, though, was never finalized. In May, your predecessor agreed to meet with mothers whose sons died suddenly from using paint strippers containing this toxic chemical. And a few days later, Scott Pruitt said, hey, we're going to finalize the proposed rule and send it out shortly, but since then we've seen nothing. It has been several months, and the mothers who are hoping to prevent their families from experiencing, other families, from experiencing the loss of the loved ones, people are really disheartened. And so my simple question, and I conclude with it, is that will you commit to sending the proposed ban of consumer chemicals uses to OMB for the final review in the next 2 weeks?
Well, we're continuing to work with OMB and the other agencies and departments that have equity in that and on that chemical issue, and we're trying to move that forward as quickly as we can. I can't commit to a specific time frame, but we are trying to move that forward.
All right. There's a lot of families, from the paint stripping chemicals to those that are sitting behind you right now, that are really relying on you to save lives. There's extraordinary injustices going on with this kind of inaction by your agency, and I hope that you'll move with all deliberate speed to address these concerns.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for being here today. I appreciate it. I know there's been a lot of talk about the small refinery exemption, so I'm going to dive in right with you. Over the past year and a half, EPA has taken actions that benefit refiners at the expense of farmers. And by retroactively granting an unprecedented number of small refinery exemptions, EPA effectively waived 2.25 billion gallons from refiners' 2016 and 2017 RFS obligations. Not only do these actions contradict President Trump's pledge to uphold congressionally mandated volumes, but they have also destroyed corn and ethanol demand, leading to lost income for Iowa's farmers at a time when farm income is already at its lowest level since 2006. Yes or no, Mr. Wheeler, do you believe the RFS should be implemented in a manner consistent with the original intent of Congress?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so let's distill, and thank you. Let's distill this even further then. For compliance year 2017, the EPA granted 29 small refinery exemptions totaling 1.45 billion gallons, which removes that many gallons from obligated parties' compliance requirement, which is the 15 billion gallons. That's the implied corn ethanol requirement, minus the 1.45 billion gallons is 13.55 billion gallons. So you just take the 15 that's implied, that's the requirement, minus the 1.45, and it gives you 13.55 billion gallons. So that's about 10% below the statutory requirement. Is that correct? It would be about 10%.
I will trust your math, Senator.
Okay,
yes.
So yes, it is about 10% below the statutory requirement. So if these gallons aren't reallocated somewhere, then you're not implementing the RFS in a manner that is consistent with the original intent of Congress, correct?
Well, part of the original intent of Congress was also to grant the waivers, and there was not a provision for reallocating that. We are taking a look at that issue, but we're trying to be much more clear and transparent as we grant any small refinery waivers. But as you're aware, we've been sued twice on this for not granting enough, and we've lost both times.
And I understand that. And there is also an obligation, though, of 15 billion gallons. And so those gallons that have been granted waivers for, we have to figure out a reallocation strategy.
I agree. We have to figure out a real allocation strategy,
Okay,
here, but we are confined by the law.
And thank you. And the law does require 15 billion gallons. So last November, before this committee, you were committed to issuing a determination on whether or not the EPA can grant the Reed vapor pressure waiver. And just last week in Iowa, President Trump again expressed support for removing the outdated regulatory barrier preventing the sale of E15 year-round and indicated his administration is, quote, very close to implementing the RVP waiver. Can you state for the record that EPA has the authority to begin a rulemaking process to provide RVP relief for ethanol blends of E15 and higher?
We can certainly start that process. It's, as you know, Senator, there are certainly people that don't believe we have that authority. The legislation that this committee considered last year would have been very clear in giving EPA that authority. But we are looking at that issue, as you and I have discussed a few times, and happy to discuss with you further on moving forward on an RVP issue.
And we find that that is very important, is something that the president has committed to. I will say in closing that RVP parity and the sale of E15 year-round is a no-cost solution that will expand a domestic market for farmers who have been adversely impacted by retaliatory tariffs. RVP parity would not only boost commodity prices, but also be viewed across rural America as the Trump administration taking concrete action to help during a time of economic hardship. Acting Administrator Wheeler, I do encourage you to follow through on the President's directive and remove this unnecessary and ridiculous restriction. I look forward to working with you on these issues. I know we'll have many, many discussions to follow. Thank you very much.
Yes, Senator. I look forward to those.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ernst. Taking the prerogative of the chairman, I want to recognize myself for a unanimous consent. Yes. There was last week, the Platts ran a story entitled U.S. Small Refinery Waivers Not Likely Lowering Biofuel Blending. The article cites Sandra Dunphy, an independent analyst who testified last week before the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and I ask unanimous consent that this to enter this article into the record at this point. Without objection, so ordered. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Administrator Wheeler.
Thank you,
as you know, I viewed your predecessor's tenure as one characterized by a tawdry personal behavior in office, a desire to do damage to the agency that he led, a flagrant absence of transactional integrity, and horrible environmental policies. And I see you as a remedy to 3 of those 4. So in that sense, I welcome you. And my visit to you, I appreciated very much your courtesy in having me in, and I very much hope that you follow through on putting Teddy Roosevelt's picture up on your wall. I think that would be a good reminder and a good signal. A lot of what needed to be repaired at EPA had to do with process stuff rather than the substantive disagreement you and I may have on environmental issues. And some of the process stuff had to do with enforcement. In the first 9 months of the Trump administration, which we have data for, enforcement actions declined by 30% compared to the first 9 months of the Bush administration and more than 35% compared to the first 9 months of the Obama administration. In that same period, EPA sought 50% less in fines and money for environmental cleanup than in the Bush administration, and almost 90% less than under the Obama administration. And some of that appears to have been a decision made by the EPA Office of Compliance and Enforcement to seek headquarters approval before beginning certain investigatory actions. And I have the memo here. Effective immediately, OECA Headquarters review is required prior to issuance of information requests under the Clean Air Act, RCRA, and the Clean Water Act. I'd like to ask the memo to be made a
Without
exhibit. What is your intention regarding that headquarters review stymieing of what had always been the prerogative of the different regional agencies in getting information about potential environmental violations?
Senator, I'm actually not,
We need to get okay.
I haven't seen that memo. I'm not sure. Is there a date, or I'm not?
This memo was dated May 31.
Of this year or last
17.
year? Of last year?
17, yeah. So it's been in place for a while, and obviously if you have to run the ability to even ask an information request through headquarters, that gives headquarters the chance to either just create massive institutional delay or even put the kibosh on an investigation from its very beginning, and that doesn't seem like the right role for headquarters.
Well, I was not aware of that memo. I would point out, though, that we did not have a Senate-confirmed person head of OECA until December of last year. I believe that's the longest time that the agency had ever gone without a Senate-confirmed enforcement person. I think the numbers have gone up significantly since Susan Bodine took over the office, and I think that the program itself has improved.
Great. Well, I'd like to ask you to get back to me on whether this memo is still in place. Additionally, one of the problems that bedeviled people trying to get information out of EPA was that FOIA requests were customarily provided extremely slowly and often only after litigation to force the issue. And members of Congress, myself included, were told, we'll get you the information you ask for when we get around to it through the FOIA process. I don't think either of those is good practice for a public agency. Could you let me know what you're doing with respect to FOIA compliance and with respect to committee requests for information?
Absolutely. First of all, on FOIA, I know at the beginning of this administration, we had a 700 FOIA case backlog, some cases going back to 2008. We've cleared up the entire backlog. And I'd also just point out for the administrator's office at EPA, we saw a 415% increase in the number of FOIA requests. What we are doing is we consolidated the FOIA program into one office under our general counsel's office, and we're in the process of hiring additional FOIA people. On the request to the committee, as Senator Carper could tell you, when I worked here on staff, I worked very hard to make sure that the minority received information from the agency, and I will continue to do that as the acting administrator at EPA. I know that we've responded to 54 of 67 requests from the minority members of this committee.
Great.
Over the
Thank
last
you.
year.
I'll send you a list of the ones that remain outstanding, and see if you can plow through those as well. Let me just close by saying that I know you've worked very closely with industry for a long time, and I hope that you will give, your very serious and earnest consideration to the concerns of people like me from coastal states. We are seeing climate change-driven sea level rise that's going to require us to redraw the map of my damn state. If that's not something to make a senator serious about protecting it, I don't know what is. So I hope that in this position you will take into account not only the concerns of industry and the concerns of the square states in the middle of the country that don't have coasts, but those of us who are looking at actually having to redraw the maps because of what is happening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Whitehouse. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, first of all, welcome to the committee. It's good to see you once again, sir.
Thank you.
I appreciate your interest in your opening statement regarding certainty and the desire to move forward with certainty and transparency. And I do think what Senator Ernst was trying to get at with regard to the renewable fuel standard and the small refinery limitation, or at least an exemption for them, and how those two fit together, I'd like to explore that with you a little bit, because it is critical that the renewable fuel standard remain in effect and that it be honored, and that it be something that producers in the central part of the country can count on. They've invested billions of dollars in creating an ethanol industry, and one that they had expected to be in until at least the year 2022. Now, if we read this correctly, there clearly was the intent of Congress that there be for traditional ethanol production a 15 billion gallon per year allowance. We also understand that within that same legislation that there was an allowance that you could make exceptions for hardship for small refineries. There was nothing that we can find that indicates that that would limit or reduce the 15 billion gallon minimum for traditional ethanol production. Can you share with me where you would come up with, or where there would be logic in taking or in reducing the renewable fuel standard from the 15 billion to follow what was already included in the original law? In other words, when we wrote the law, when the Congress wrote the law, they clearly understood that 15 billion was there and made clear. They also understood that we would take into account that small refineries may have a hardship. There was nothing that indicated that that 15 billion would be reduced. Can you share with me a little bit your thought process on why you would not continue to push and to reallocate for the 15 billion gallons?
Well, as one of the former congressional staffers who helped write that section of the law, I wish we had spent a little bit more time on some of the details of it now that I'm helping to implement it. But if I could start by saying that we are working to provide more transparency around the small refinery program, the exemption program. We're creating a dashboard where we will publicize all the information about when we grant a waiver and the circumstances around the waiver. We have to balance that with the confidential business information of the impacted companies. But we're working to try to be more transparent on that side of the program, and we're looking to see what we can do as far as making up the difference when we have to grant a waiver from the 15 billion gallons. But it's not a clear-cut solution.
If I could, just let me,
yes.
I don't think, and I don't find any place where it says it's a waiver from the 15 billion. I think it says an individual refinery may get from their responsibility, but that doesn't absolve us from meeting the 15 billion gallon limit.
I agree, but then you have the problem, though, that the waivers are being granted, they're being requested and granted after the numbers have already been set, and we're talking about whether or not we can go back retroactively to change the numbers and change the compliance numbers for the other people in the industry.
Well, I like the fact that you're looking at transparency
yes.
within this process, and in fact. I think you're moving in the right direction. I actually sent a letter to your predecessor dated April 13th of this year, and I requested that the EPA provide more information on the factors that go into the granting of small refinery exemptions. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that the copy of the letter be
without
sent for the
objection.
record. I have yet to receive a substantive response to the letter as requested, and this is an issue which is of serious consequence to my constituents in South Dakota and throughout the upper Midwest. Would you commit to reviewing this request and responding to it in a substantive manner?
Yes, Senator, I will do that.
I understand that information that is designated as confidential business information has reportedly been a factor in granting the small refinery exemptions, but there must be aspects of the EPA's decision-making process that do not strictly fall under this definition, and I just hope that you would continue in an open and transparent process to share with us the process that you're using in granting these.
Yes.
And then the other piece of this, sir, the RVP across the United States, as the President has indicated his interest in doing it, I would hope that we would expedite that process so that we can actually start marketing this product across the United States year-around. And if that happens, I think a lot of the issues surrounding meeting that RFP would be handled, because with those markets available year-round, it means people would actually buy the equipment, have the equipment available if they could use it throughout the year. Those pumps are expensive, and they don't want to use it if the EPA is going to come in and say you can use it 6 months out of the year but not year-round. Would you commit to trying to expedite that part of this process to see if we can't get this behind us and help this industry to succeed?
As I'm sure you know, that was part of a broader package of a deal trying to address concerns of the the oil refining industry, along with the concerns of the ethanol producers. And I'm looking actively to try to figure out how
I
we can
appreciate
move
that. And
forward
Mr. Chairman,
with that.
I know my
Something
time has
on
passed,
behalf.
but you've taken care of the small refineries. What about the small farmers? What about the folks that are producing on a year-to-year basis enough to get by in a time in which we've got trade issues in front of us and a time in which they expected that an RFP would be honored by the federal government that we made several years ago? So you've taken care of the small refineries, but you haven't taken care of the small farmers. I think we should look at that.
The RVO number for 2019 is, I believe, 500 million gallons more than what it was the previous year. We also added the sorghum pathway to help farmers and finding another biofuel feedstock for the RFS program. We are looking very actively to see what we can do to provide more, not just flexibility in the program, but more assistance to the agriculture.
Look forward to working with you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Rouse. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, welcome.
Thank you, Senator.
And I had a question along the lines that Senator Carper asked you. He asked you about the Delaware filing under the Good Neighbor petition provisions of the Clean Air Act. Maryland also filed a petition back in November 2016. EPA did not respond to it until just a few months ago, at which time they said they proposed to deny the petition. This is an issue that has united all Marylanders, Republicans and Democrats alike. All of our members of the congressional delegation sent a letter to the EPA asking EPA to take another look at this. Governor Hogan, a Republican governor, has asked the same thing. So the first ask I would have is the same that Senator Carper made of you. Would you commit to meet with our Maryland Department of Environment Secretary Ben Grumbles to go over Maryland's position on the Good Neighbor petition?
I'd be happy to meet with Mr. Grumbles. I've known him for years and worked with him.
I appreciate it. The letter we got back from EPA said that there was not enough information. I think Ben Grumbles, if you know him, is very diligent. I looked at it, he provided a lot of information, and that it was too costly, even though what we're asking for is plants in these other states to just apply already existing technology. Do you have any details on why EPA proposed to deny the Maryland petition?
I don't, and I've not looked at the Maryland petition in the 4 weeks that I've been acting administrator.
No, I understand. So I appreciate your willingness to do that and meet with Secretary Grumbles. I think it's important because it is simply unfair, and the Clean Air Act envisioned this, its amendments envision this, that some states are doing their job to clean up their air, but their air gets polluted by states that are not doing their job. And so I hope we can resolve this issue. I think you live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed of Virginia, is that right?
I do, Senator.
All right.
Yes.
And, you know, the Bay agreements over a long period of time have been one of the great sort of environmental success stories. You always feel like you're running in place with the Bay because there's such a drainage basin from so many states and so much development. But the good news is, as a result of these agreements, and most recently the 2014 agreement, we appear to be making progress. Long way to go, but progress. And the most recent agreement included a provision with respect to what's the TMDL, total maximum daily load. Can you commit that you, as the acting head of the EPA, will continue to enforce EPA's role within that agreement?
Absolutely. And also want to point out, it is good news on the Bay. We have a lot of work to do, but just over the last 10 years, the seagrass in the Bay have gone from 34,000 acres up to 100,000 acres, and that is one of the first indicators of a healthy Bay. So I think we've made a lot of progress, and we continue to make progress.
Got it. I appreciate that. In the House, our House colleagues attached a provision to the Environmental Appropriations Bill, a rider to eliminate EPA's enforcement authority under that agreement. I'm assuming that you would oppose that limitation on your enforcement authority. Is that right?
We would certainly like to keep all the enforcement authorities that we can.
Thank you.
Yes.
Now, just last week, EPA released a 2016 to 2017 milestone and midpoint progress report on the Bay. And again, as you indicated, I indicated, there's been some progress. It did note that the state of Pennsylvania is not meeting its targets for agriculture and urban-suburban runoff. Actually, as part of the Farm Bill, I've worked on a bipartisan basis to increase the funds available under the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, so hoping that will go forward as part of the Ag Bill. But what actions can EPA take? As you know, a lot of the pollution in the Bay does come down the Susquehanna River, major tributary to the Bay. This has been an ongoing challenge. What can EPA do to help all of us improve Pennsylvania's performance?
We're trying to work more cooperatively with all the states in the Chesapeake Bay region. I mentioned to Senator Cardin that in my first week as a deputy administrator, I attended the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and next week I will be attending the Chesapeake Bay Leadership Council meeting in Baltimore, and that will be my first meeting on the Chesapeake Bay since I've assumed the duties of acting administrator. And I need to look a little bit more into what we can do to work with Pennsylvania, but we are trying to work cooperatively with all the states in the Chesapeake Bay.
No, I appreciate that. And EPA has played a vital role, so I appreciate your commitment there. And I will say, as your own EPA report indicated, the pollution coming down the Susquehanna River from Pennsylvania remains a major challenge. So we want to work cooperatively with Pennsylvania as well, but we really do need your help. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for being here with us today. I would first like to take a moment to express my appreciation for your emphasis on improving transparency and increasing good governance practices at the EPA. From what I've heard in the testimony thus far, a very cooperative spirit on both sides of the aisle to help not just with our national issues, but with our state issues as well, and certainly appreciate that. As you well know, West Virginia bore the brunt of the last 8 years of bureaucratic red tape coming out of Washington, a lot of it from the EPA. We're climbing out of that. Our unemployment rate is near its lowest since 2008. Our growth rate is tracking the national average, and maybe in some has even exceeded the national rate, which is great. And this is an anticipation of things that's going on now, the regulatory relief that you've been a part of at the EPA, the tax reform and investment in infrastructure investments. So we're encouraged by what we see, but we still have a labor participation rate that's lower, and we need to use our skilled workforce deployed in responsible and innovative utilization of our natural resources, which we have in abundance in my state. My first question is on the Clean Power Plan. As you know, I think you know, I'm sure you know, that Appalachia was essentially ignored when the Clean Power Plan first rule was proposed. We couldn't get the EPA to come. Subsequently, this EPA held its first hearing in West Virginia and heard opinions from all sides about the Clean Power Plan. So, you know, I've talked about our growing economy in West Virginia and being led by our energy sector. I would like to know from you, how do you plan to address the failings that were in the previous Clean Power Plan? Where are you on this? And do you expect your rule will return to an inside-the-fence approach and use technology that are actually commercially available? That was another sticking point. They're requiring technologies that were never commercially viable, and touting them as being a panacea, I think, which we knew did not really exist. So your comments on the Clean Power Plan.
Thank you, Senator. And on my first day as acting administrator, we sent a new proposal to OMB for interagency review for replacement for the Clean Power Plan. You know, the difference that I would say between this approach and the approach of the Obama administration is that we are following the four corners of the Clean Air Act and what we are proposing. You know, the 2015 proposal had the dubious distinction of being the first environmental regulation to have a stay issued by the Supreme Court.
Right.
And I believe that was done because it was outside of what the law directed us to do. So we are going to follow the law, and hopefully the proposal will be coming out for public comment sometime in the next 30 to 60 days.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. As well, I want to talk about chemical safety thresholds. I would encourage a particular emphasis on the PFAS. This is a chemical that's been found in waters, particularly in the Parkersburg and Martinsburg area of our state. I have previously urged transparency with the former administrator when it came to the release of the toxicological report that came out that was very long and very complicated, so I can't really interpret that for you. I'm hoping that you will do that as well. So would you agree that the PFAS issue is a serious concern and is a high priority within the EPA?
Absolutely. It is a serious concern, and it is a high priority. It was actually one of the first briefings that I requested from the career staff at the agency when I first started as the deputy administrator, and it remains a priority for me and for the agency as we move forward.
Well, thank you for that. I think that was obviously the intent of the law that we all worked on, bipartisan. But I'm concerned that we still don't have the leveling of the appropriate levels, both in safety levels, either in the soil or in the water. And it's causing a lot of concern for me as a representative of our state. Let me just talk a little bit about coal, because we know coal's come back. It's come back to a reasonable level. And could you, just in the brief time we have left, say from your perspective, I know you have a lot of experience with coal, how do you see this in terms of a more robust coal industry and the environment, and where you're planning to move with that? That's a big question.
It is, and let me address it this way. I've always believed in all of the above on energy sources, and I don't believe that it's the EPA's job to pick winners or losers. It is our responsibility to enact the laws that Congress passes. And under my leadership, we will not pick winners and losers between the different fuel sources. That's something that the market will have to decide. But I think it's very important that we don't enact regulations that penalize one energy source over another, or emphasize one energy source over another. Last week, I visited a solar panel facility in Massachusetts. For the first time 2 weeks ago, I'd never been to the Marcellus Shale to see the drilling that's going on there. We're trying very hard to be straight down the road and not pick winners or losers on energy sources. I don't believe that's the EPA's responsibility.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, since 2010, the new fuel economy emission standards have saved consumers more than $63 billion at the pump, kept 540 million barrels of oil in the ground, reduced carbon pollution by 250 metric tons. Over the lifetime of the current fuel economy standards, consumers will save $1 trillion on gasoline and will keep 12 billion barrels of oil in the ground. That's the simple formula for fuel economy. You save consumers money and you save the planet at the same time. And that's why big oil is attacking these standards. The oil industry is scared to death that the billions of barrels of reserves they are currently claiming on their balance sheets to the Securities and Exchange Commission will end up as so-called stranded assets. They are scared to death that $1 trillion will stay stranded in the pockets of consumers. And that is why the Trump administration is moving to roll back these standards. There's been a lot of news recently about a rift between President Trump and the Koch brothers. President Trump and the Koch brothers might disagree these days on politics, but they are always in agreement on petroleum. And that's why this rollback of fuel economy standards is really all about petroleum. It is oil above all. According to a leaked draft of the proposed rule, the Trump rollback of fuel economy standards, the #1 option that the Trump administration is considering is freezing the standards at 2020 level. that we don't increase the fuel economy standards after 2020. Mr. Wheeler, yes or no? Do you agree that freezing the fuel economy emissions standards at 2020 levels would lead to more oil being consumed than if we kept the standards at their current trajectory?
Senator, I'm not sure on that, and I want to be on the record as saying that I have not talked to anybody in the oil industry or received any information from them.
I didn't ask you that question. I asked you, would more oil be consumed if we froze the standards at 2020? That's my question. Yes or no?
I believe the analysis shows that more oil would be consumed.
That is correct. Even the
but
Trump
it also will
administration-
save 12,000 lives.
Even the Trump
$500 billion.
administration's draft report acknowledges we will consume 500,000 more barrels of oil per day if we freeze these standards. And by the way, by 2030, we back out under existing standards, if they continued, 2.5 million barrels of oil per day being imported into the United States from Saudi Arabia, from other OPEC countries. That's the number, 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Yes or no, Mr. Wheeler, do you agree that freezing the standards at 2020 levels would mean consumers would pay more to fill up their gas tanks than under the current standards?
That I do not know. I know that we have $500 billion in savings to the American consumers under the proposal.
Well, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, freezing the standards would cost American drivers an additional $20 billion alone in 2025 due to higher spending on gasoline. That's money that is transferred right out of the pockets of consumers into the big oil coffers. Yes or no? Do you agree that a freeze on increasing the fuel economy standards would lead to more climate pollution than if we maintained the current standards?
I believe our data shows that it would be negligible between the Obama proposal and our proposal.
Well, you're wrong. Freezing the standards would mean an additional 2.2 billion metric tons of global warming pollution by 2040, equal to 43 coal-fired power plants. There's a famous line, Mr. Wheeler, in the movie All the President's Men Follow the Money. When you look at the $1 trillion that big oil will never receive from American consumers and the 12 billion barrels of oil that they will never produce under the current standards, it becomes pretty clear why big oil would want to attack these standards. And all the auto industry has to do is sit back and drive the getaway car. So let me just ask you one final question, Mr. Wheeler. Administrator Pruitt committed to release the EPA scientific report on the carcinogen formaldehyde, but never did so. Will you commit to releasing this report?
Are you referring to the IRIS report on formaldehyde?
Yeah.
I've not been briefed specifically on the IRIS formaldehyde report, but I have sat down with our IRIS staff, and what I'm trying to do is to provide more certainty to that process to make sure we know how the different assessments will be used in the regulatory programs. And it's my understanding that we still have a number of steps to complete on the formaldehyde assessment.
When will you release it?
Before, well, the question that I have to our IRIS staff is what is the purpose of the assessment at this point, and whether or not the data that they've used in the assessment is still current, because I know they started that back in before 2010.
Will you commit to releasing that report?
I'm sure we will release it, but I need to make sure that the science in the report is still accurate. And what I've asked, not just for that report, but for everything that we're doing on the IRIS program, to make sure that we know the purpose of the assessment, because we have a lot of chemicals that we should and could be assessing under the IRIS program, and I want to make sure that they are being used in our regulatory process, because we have other chemicals that need to be assessed as well.
Right.
So that's one of the questions that I've asked our program staff.
Well, Pruitt committed to releasing it, and I hope that you put it at the top of your list. I expect you to. And get it released so that the public can understand what those dangers are. Thank you.
And Senator, on the different reports that you mentioned under the CAFE, we should be going out for in the Federal Register in the next day or two with the CAFE proposal, and I would hope that all those organizations will submit those reports for the record.
We're now into the second vote, and we're about halfway through. I wanted to try to get to the additional, but thank you so much for your comments, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here today.
Thank you.
Many of my colleagues have already discussed this issue, but I would like to also visit with you about small refinery exemptions to the RFS. As you know, the law allows refineries that produce 75,000 barrels or less per day to seek an exemption from the RFS for the reason of disproportionate economic hardship. The EPA, in consultation with the Department of Energy, must consider the findings from a 2011 DOE study and, quote, other economic factors when analyzing these requests. So this disproportionate economic hardship is the critical factor in determining whether a small refinery is awarded an exemption. How is that calculated? You know, that's what's great interest to small refineries, because it could decide whether they have to comply with the RFS or whether they get a free pass. And my constituents in Nebraska and others for whom the RFS is a very important item would be interested in how you interpret that process for purposes of making sure that the law is being upheld. And for Congress, who wrote the law, understanding how you calculate disproportionate economic hardship is vital for purposes of making sure that you are carrying out that law as we intended. So for these reasons, I'd like to discuss how you're doing that analysis. It's my understanding that the law does not define disproportionate economic hardship. It is also my understanding that EPA regulations do not define disproportionate economic hardship. By its definition, disproportionate means you're comparing the impact on the petitioner to the impact on one or more others. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct, Senator. If I could say on the small refinery process, we work closely with the Department of Energy. They do the initial analysis, and then we work with them on providing additional analysis as well. What I've committed to do and what we are going to do is provide more transparency in how we make these decisions. We are in the process of developing a dashboard so we can put all the information out publicly so that people know when we're issuing a small refinery waiver and the circumstances around that. We have to make sure that we take into account any confidential business information of the company applying for the small business refinery exemption. But we want to try to be as transparent as we can and put all that information, including our process, out for the public to see.
Just to confirm, are you saying that the EPA compares the high cost of compliance relative to the entire refinery industry? So all you basically have to prove, Mr. Administrator, is that you are a small refinery and produce less than 75,000 barrels a day, and that's your ticket in the door?
Senator, if I could respond back to you in writing on that, because I want to be very careful, and because this issue has been being looked at very carefully, not only by us, by everybody else. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you the correct information. If I could respond back to you in writing, I'd appreciate that.
I would appreciate it. Thank you, sir. What about the disproportionate economic hardship? The court in 2017 said the EPA can't go so far as to require that a refinery be at risk of going out of business to exempt them from the RFS. But I believe it's equally unacceptable for the EPA to merely exempt a refinery because they fit the definition of a small refinery. And I would think you would agree that there is space between those two options. Would you?
I would agree there is space between those two options. I think just because a company is a small refinery does not mean it should be entitled to a small refinery exemption. There are other market and business concerns to go into that analysis.
Okay. When the agency awarded those 48 small refinery waivers retroactively for 2016 and 2017, I think that it effectively established a de facto RIN cap. Do you agree with that?
A de facto RIN cap. Well, we take that into account. We take into account the available RINs as we move forward in setting the RVO numbers for the next year. So I'm not sure that I would say it was a de facto RIN cap because we do look at the RIN numbers available before we set the next RVO. try to factor that into our analysis.
Okay. If I could get you questions on this pretty
Absolutely.
complex issue, I would appreciate answers in a timely.
Okay, having just voted, I assume that we've gone all the way through and that you have a request, Senator Carper, for one last question.
Yeah, I do, please.
Yeah.
Senator Duckworth has not asked her first round. She was here, but she was, other people came in ahead of her and said she's going to try to get back. Well, hopefully if she does, and if she does, I'll yield to her. But thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up, if I could, Mr. Wheeler, on your previous answer on cross-state pollution. And in your answer, you may recall you stated that most areas, I don't know if this is a quote, but it's a good paraphrase. I think you stated essentially that most areas will be in attainment for ozone in the early 2020s. And so with that having been said, here's my question. EPA has not modeled the effects of all of its planned clean air rollbacks on cross-state ozone pollution. Given that, can EPA be certain that Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, all these other states on the East Coast, can be certain that we will be in attainment? How can we, EPA, be certain that all of us are going to be in attainment in 2023, as EPA has claimed it would be? Because you've not modeled the effects of all its planned Clean Air Act rollbacks on cross-state ozone pollution. Seems like we're getting the cart ahead of the horse.
Well, I can't predict with certainty on that, but what I'm told by our by the career staff at the agency and the Air Office is that our analysis shows that most areas of the country will be able to reach attainment in the early 2020s. There's of course factors that could change between now and then, but on the current pathway that we are with the emissions that we forecast in the different states and the areas of the country, we anticipate that most areas of the country will be in attainment in the early 2020s.
Maybe most areas, but a bunch of the areas that are not in attainment now. Again, it just seems counterintuitive that EPA has not modeled the effects of all of its planned clean air rollbacks on cross-state pollution, yet EPA feels like Delaware and other states are going to be in attainment in 2023. It just doesn't add up. We'll be following up on questions for the record, and maybe we can get some clarification on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Whitehouse, did you?
Thank you. I would like to, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up with Administrator Wheeler on something that he said in response to a question to another senator, and it had to do, Mr. Wheeler, with not picking winners and losers in the energy industry, and that you would treat all energy sources equally. If you're presented with a polluting energy source on the one hand and a non-polluting energy source on the other, how do you treat them equally when it's EPA's duty to protect against pollution?
Well, Senator, if one energy source has emissions of a criteria pollutant or any of the other pollutants that we regulate, we would of course regulate the pollutants for that industry. I'm not suggesting that every single environmental law would apply to every single industry and we treat it across the board. There's obviously different, the coal combustion residual would only apply to coal-fired power plants. We wouldn't apply something like that, of course, to solar or wind. But my point is that we shouldn't be enacting regulations that favor one energy source over the other. We will implement all of the laws passed by Congress.
How would a regulation that protected against pollution not advantage a non-polluting energy source over a polluting energy source?
Well, I believe some of the criticisms of the Obama Clean Power Plan, for example, was that it gave preferential treatment to some energy sources and the way that they calculated emissions. But my point in saying that is it's not the EPA's role. We're trying to be very even-handed and not pick winners and losers between the different energy sources and to equally promote all of them at the same time.
I just want to make sure that your view of what is preferential among energy sources isn't driven by whether or not they are polluters. Because if you're not going to prefer, in the sense of putting regulatory protections up against polluting versus non-polluting sources,
Senator,
we've got a real
are
problem on our hands.
We are regulating sources that pollute, that release, that have emissions of.
So if a polluting source has to bear a regulatory burden to protect against its pollution, that's not what you mean by.
That is not what I mean.
Picking winners lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. We were going to come to an abrupt stop after this vote, but we're going to make an exception because Senator Duckworth wants to be heard, but she'll be the last one to ask questions, and then we'll close the meeting. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're very generous and
well, thank
quite
you.
a gentleman. Mr.
That's
Willard,
because you co-sponsored my aviation bill at Oshkosh.
well, exactly. And I just talked to the airline pilots this morning, and they're big fans of yours. So, Mr. Wheeler, although we don't see eye to eye on most environmental issues, I believe that you are making a good faith effort to reverse the course at EPA and operate in a transparent manner. For example, I support your recent memo calling on your colleagues to be open and accessible and committing to leading by example on open government efforts. And so I thank you for that. I think this is a critical first step towards restoring the public's trust in the EPA. As Acting Administrator Wheeler, as you know, Congress provided you with an incredibly broad authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act to hire up to 30 individuals without regard to civil service laws. For years, under Republican and Democratic administrations, Congress has trusted EPA administrators to responsibly exercise this special hiring authority. However, your predecessor violated this trust in using the authority to give personal aides lavish pay raises after the White House denied such requests. To make sure you and future administrators use this special hiring authority in an ethical and transparent manner, Ranking Member Carper and I introduced the EPA Special Hiring Authority Transparency Act. Our bill simply requires that EPA report to Congress whenever it makes an appointment. To restore confidence in the use of this authority, will you commit to supporting our legislation that will improve transparency and make sure this committee is notified in regard to who is being appointed under the special hiring authority and why?
Sir, I'll be happy to work with you on your legislation, and I'll be happy to provide a list of the people that we've hired under that authority as well.
Thank you. One area I believe we can work together on, in addition, is reducing lead exposure. Lead is a dangerous and neurotoxin for vulnerable populations like young children, pregnant mothers, and the elderly. Exposure to lead can be life-threatening. Under your predecessor, an interagency task force on lead was convened. However, Congress has not been briefed on the work of this agency. It is unclear whether the administration fully understands the urgency of this problem and whether they are genuinely compelled to address this issue. Will you support reporting to Congress on the finding of this task force?
Yes, Senator, I will.
This needs to be in.
Thank you. On a similar note, will you commit to releasing all the records on the Superfund task force?
I thought we'd already done that, but I certainly look into that and have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that.
That predated my time at the agency.
Okay, thank you. And finally, before I close, I want to address a critical program, the Bipartisan Renewable Fuel Standard Program, the RFS. It has already been discussed at length in this hearing.
A few times.
A few times, yes. Well, we all are out there to support our farmers. I'm alarmed by this administration's efforts to undermine this program. Even Brett Kavanaugh, the nominee to serve on the Supreme Court, has sided with the oil industry in several RFS-related cases. Mr. Kavanaugh went as far as to argue that the oil and food industries were palpably and negatively affected by EPA's allegedly illegal E15 waiver and had standing to directly challenge the E15 waiver in court. As you discussed with my colleagues, Senator Ernst and Senator Rounds and Senator Fisher, EPA has been undermining the RFS and abusing the small refinery exemptions. We need to understand how EPA is making decisions on granting these exemptions. Will you promise to report to Congress on how these decisions are being made, provide public notice on these decisions, and bring greater transparency to this work?
Absolutely. In fact, we're developing a dashboard so that the whole public can see what we're doing on the issue and when and how we're granting the waivers. We have to be careful that there are confidential business information claims by some of the refiners when they apply for it. So we have to guard that, but we want to make sure that we release as much information as we can to be very transparent and let everybody know what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thank you. I need to stress again that ethanol is an American-grown, American-produced product as opposed to foreign oil that we have sent troops for a decade to fight over. I'd rather be supporting American farmers growing American produce to put in American gas tanks. I understand that the EPA may be constrained by law, as you have testified, and I look forward to working with my colleagues, Senator Rounds and Ernst, on a legislative fix. And I very much thank you for being here, and I certainly enjoy our discussion, and I very much appreciate the return to transparency that you are pledging to bring to the EPA. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. I appreciate your being here very much. I have 2 unanimous consent requests to get into the record. There will be no other questioners. First of all, I would note that last week, 21 senators sent a letter to EPA opposing the reallocation of small refinery obligations to other refineries under the RFS. And I ask unanimous consent that this letter be made a part of the record without objection, so ordered. Secondly, I have a chart. I think it's important. I understand while I was down voting that somebody came up, some complaints were there in terms of responses, and I want to just compliment you and the EPA for the way you have done that. Hold that chart up. The chart is just one example of the huge increase in correspondence EPA has seen over the last administration. For the administrator's office, it's over 400% increase in fiscal year 2017 over the previous 2 fiscal years. Again, it's just for the administrator's office. It does not include other programs like air, water, land, general counsel, research, and development, chemicals, and all that. In total, the EPA has so far responded to 84% of the inquiries elected offices have sent in. That's federal, state, and local. EPA has responded to 81% of the minority members' oversight letters, 65.5% of all of their inquiries, and it is not doing so. Hold it up again. Not doing so. 23,430 pages of documents have been delivered to the minority members, and I don't know whether the minority has had time to read all of these. I suggest probably they haven't. It doesn't sound like an agency that's ignoring anyone. Now, I want to commend you and get this on the record so that people are aware of the great job that we are doing with the EPA. All right?
Thank you, Senator.
You're very welcome. If there are no more questions for today, members may also submit follow-up questions for the record. The hearing record will be open for 2 weeks. I want to thank the witnesses for their time and testimony today, and we are adjourned. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. You bet. You bet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stuff?
Yeah.
So enjoy. Yeah, just FYI, I always